I'd been waiting to try the floating strips technique for a little while, and this week's TGIF Popping It Up challenge finally gave me the excuse. What I wasn't expecting was for one card to turn into three. Along the way, I discovered a simpler version, and I even found a way to create the floating effect without using a window sheet at all. So let's start at the beginning. I already had plenty of narrow strips sitting in my scraps, so this felt like the perfect project to use them up. Stampin' Up's June Colour Challenge helped guide my choices. Instead of using a brand new sheet of plastic, I'm actually recycling this clear cover from the front of a bound document. I've been reaching for liquid glue a lot lately, but for this technique I actually found double-sided tape work much better. It keeps everything exactly where you put it without the strips sliding around while you're working. This skinnier strip was the only exception. I found it easier to put the adhesive directly onto the paper before trimming it. It's worth checking that your die completely covers the design before you cut. I noticed this last strip was just peeking outside the circle, so I made a quick adjustment before running it through. This large circle die took a little more persuasion than I expected to get through the thick plastic. I ended up running it through my Big Shot several times before everything released cleanly, and there was still a couple of spots where a bit of gentle pushing was needed. Originally I thought I'd use Old Olive for the leaf because that colour was part of the challenge palette. But once I held it over the striped background, it just kind of disappeared. The white, on the other hand, really stood out, so that became a really easy decision. One happy surprise was that the adhesive tape held every tiny little piece exactly where it needed to stay while I removed the sections I didn't need. The inlay was still a little fiddly though, and that was the moment another idea started forming, but I'll save that experiment for later in the video. Most of the floating strips technique cards I'd seen were mounted over white cardstock, but while I was playing around with my scraps, I noticed how dramatic these colours looked against the dark grey background instead. The black and white patterned strips add even more contrast, while those tiny old olive strips quietly bring the final challenge colour into the design without competing with the floating circle. From here, it's mostly putting everything together. I'm fairly generous with dimensionals on this type of card because I don't want that floating panel to sag or warp over time. I'm hiding the foam behind the coloured strips so you still get that floating illusion from the front. For these tiny sections, I simply trimmed the edge from the larger dimensional packet to make my very own narrow foam strips. I decided to keep the sentiment really simple. With so much happening in the background, I don't think the card needed anything elaborate, so this mixed font best wishes felt like the perfect finishing touch. Finally, I added a few enamel dots in similar shades to the cardstock strips. They're only a tiny detail, but I think they tie in all those warm colours together beautifully. I was really happy with how this first card turned out. The floating effect is so striking, and I loved how all those strips became the feature of the design. But I couldn't stop thinking about that fiddly inlaid die cutting. Surely there had to be an easier way. So for my second version, I decided to simplify things. I went with different colours this time, chosen to mirror a sunset over the water theme. I glued these down onto the clear plastic sheet the same way you saw earlier and die cut those with an oval die this time. This one was definitely a little more stubborn to cut. The thicker plastic didn't release quite as cleanly, so the edges came out a little rough in places. Thankfully, it was nothing a quick tidy up with a sanding block couldn't fix. And because I knew I'd be adding a focal image over the top, most of those rough spots ended up hidden anyway. It did make me wonder though, if finding a nice thin piece of plastic is one of the trickiest parts of this technique, is there another way to do it? I tucked that thought away for later and finished this card first. I reached for grey again for the background because I loved the contrast in the first card. This one's grey granite, a touch lighter and warmer in tone from the basic grey in the first card. This time I added a few white ink splatters using my aqua painter. It's one of my favourite techniques for creating a soft spray effect. I also still had some scraps from the first card sitting on my desk, including that black and white polka dot paper, so it felt like the perfect opportunity to use up those as well. Once the background was ready, I added the floating strip panel using plenty of dimensionals hidden behind the coloured strips. This version has a much more masculine feel. I die cut a black seaweed from one of my sailing sets and tucked that down the side before adding a lighthouse. I actually stamped this lighthouse several times. I was hoping for a silhouette look, but none of them turned out quite the way I imagined. In the end, I borrowed the base from one of the blue versions I'd stamped and combined the two. Sometimes a little bit of paper surgery gives you some great results. The sentiment stayed nice and simple with a little "you're the best." I tucked some twine behind it just to soften all those straight lines and add a little texture. I mounted everything onto a grey granite card base, and after completely forgetting embellishments on last week's mermaid, I made sure I didn't repeat that mistake. These little enamel dots in similar shades were just the finishing touch it needed. By this stage, I had plenty of leftover pieces of cardstock sitting on my desk. I'd also been thinking about one thing throughout these first two cards. Most floating strip tutorials use window sheets, but what if you don't have any? Could the technique still work? I decided it was worth finding out. I still had all these beautiful scraps sitting on my desk, so I pulled together a little rainbow, moving from the warm oranges and yellows through to greens and blues. This time, I chose wider strips. I had a feeling that if I was going to build the design piece by piece afterwards, I'd need width for structure and to be able to hide the dimensionals behind each section cleanly. Instead of sticking the strips to a window sheet, I laid some washi tape down first, positioned my star die over the top, and simply pressed each strip onto the tape. So the layers were washi tape, then the die, and then the cardstock strips. It held everything surprisingly well while I worked. Just like before, I swapped out the last strip for a wider one to make sure the die would be completely covered before cutting. One thing I noticed straight away was how much easier it was to die cut this time. Without the extra thickness of the plastic, it went through the machine in a single pass. I used this week's Global Design Project sketch as my starting point and kept the background nice and simple. The same black and white patterned paper made another appearance here. I was definitely making the most of those scraps by this stage. To rebuild the design, I first cut out a matching star from plain white cardstock. This became my template. I added dimensionals to the back of each coloured strip and simply worked from the bottom upwards, fitting each piece back into place. One thing I really liked about using a star is that each section had its own unique shape. Unlike a circle where pieces can look quite similar, these little points and notches almost work like a puzzle, making it much easier to see where everything belonged. The washi tape did leave a couple of faint marks across some of the strips, but in the end it really didn't matter. Most of these areas disappeared underneath the focal element anyway. I didn't film every last step of assembling this one because it was getting rather late by this point, but here's how it all came together. I love it when trying one new technique turns into a whole series of ideas. What started as simply wanting to make one floating strips card ended up becoming 3 completely different designs, each teaching me something new along the way. I think my favourite discovery has to be the no window sheet version. It wasn't exactly the same as the traditional technique, but I love that it creates such a similar look using supplies that most of us already have in our craft rooms. I'd love to know which of the 3 versions is your favourite, so let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed crafting along with me today, I'd love to have you subscribe so you don't miss future ideas and scrap busting projects. Until next time.